and welcome to the first ever episode of Conflict and Compromise, the LGBT plus community. I am Alon Berg, this is Hannah Ritter, and in today's podcast episode, we will introduce the theme of our series and also talk about bisexual rights and struggles within the LGBT community. Let's get started.
Since the rise of support for gay reformist movements during 1960s and 70s, much of the lesbian and gay community has sacrificed the support of marginalized groups within the same community to prioritize and further propel their own efforts towards reaching equality for same-sex couples.
Now, a disclaimer, this podcast in no way was created to bash or point fingers at the already ostracized lesbian and gay community, but rather shed light upon the marginalization that occurred within the same community. This marginalization was not necessarily done with malice intended, but usually with the intention that these baby steps would help the community move forward, even if it wasn't as a whole.
For many. Before the Stonewall riots and other LGBT rights demonstrations, sometimes even in modern day, people could lose jobs for the simple fact of being queer or being affiliated with the LGBT community. This often led to instances of harassment and violence in which federal laws was not there to step in and support the victims, as neither sexual orientation nor gender identity are a federal protected class status in America.
Intentionally or not, the lesbian and gay community has maintained a prolonged attitude of exclusion towards other less publicized identities, which cause these smaller groups to suffer.
One popular theory reasons that because members of the LG community were treated badly, a significant amount of the anger and shame of homophobia was bottled up within and often released upon other marginalized groups.
Given this, gay and lesbian, quote, victory, unquote, especially in legal areas, is often marked as LGBTQ plus victory.
Another troubling prospect was a sudden established standard of same-sex couple and members of the community. Any relationship or individual that did not resemble this standard was ignored and marginalized, and their progress advanced at a comparatively much slower pace. This primarily white, cisgender, and affluent standard reflected a small, privileged percentage of the community, yet it was the most normalized and accepted, which harmed the trans, bisexual, and other queer folk whose perseverance, support, and desire for rights were almost entirely ignored.
Bi-invisibility is a popular topic amongst those it affects, since those who identify as bisexual experience exclusions by persons within the community. Hateful criticisms have stated that if bisexuals don't pick a side or if they enter a heterosexual relationship, they do not belong in the LGBTQ community, despite their identity. Some common microaggressions involve deliberately calling bisexuals allies, or invalidating their experience with discrimination since they are viewed as half straight, or even mislabeling them based on their current partner's identity.
This led to many people discarding their full identities in favor of labeling themselves simply gay rather than bisexual, queer, or any other less commonly accepted label. In other cases, those who chose to stick with their identities were often involuntarily labeled as gay or lesbian if they were in a same-sex relationship, while their different sex relationships were ignored and dismissed, leading to an increasing erasure of non-LG identities.
Discussion time! These next statements are largely our opinions based on evidence we have gathered to date. Here we go. Why didn't the bisexual community feel the need to have a protest of their own? Do you think they were content with being amassed under the umbrella of gay? Do you think they knew the consequences or the invisibility that would come of this? Okay, so I believe that for the bisexual community, it was less of a matter of unnecessity, but more of a problem of inability to gather the numbers and support that they would need to organize a successful protest, especially against both homophobic people and biphobic members of the gay and lesbian community.
Though there might have been some people who identify as bisexual that were optimistic about the state of the fight for gay rights, these people would have believed that the movement the LGBT community fought would carry the queer community as a whole.
Some bisexuals may have been content with the amount of acceptance that they were shown and may have been fine with simply joining larger protests under the umbrella term gay.
I don't suspect that these hopeful bisexuals realized the consequences that would come of being grouped under the word gay. Thus, the ultimately shallow outlook on the word gay led to their invisibility and exclusion of the bisexual community among other marginalized groups within the queer community.
As a way to bring others into this discussion, we interviewed some of our peers, some of whom wished to remain anonymous. One of the most popular questions we asked was, are labels such as bisexual or queer really necessary to accomplish equality? Here are some of the answers we received. One said,
I think that labels definitely help people figure themselves out, but in terms of equality, I do not think they are entirely necessary. I think the idea of equality doesn't apply to specific labels.
No, labels are not important because there are no labels, and as a result, you just see everyone as equal. If you treat everyone as a person rather than label them by gender, race, ethnicity, appearance, etc., and treat all people the same, you can have equality.
Felipe, a bisexual male, said,
I think that after getting equality, the LG community has been so excited that they want to show the world who they were and push to labels. While I think labels can be harmful, I do think that they are helpful because they give people a graspable idea of a person's sexuality so as not to offend them. However, labels should not be set in stone.
Another commentator's response concurred,
Labels aren't necessary to achieve this. Not everyone is going to fit a definition exactly, so it would be easier not to generalize people.
On the other hand, Emma, a female who identifies as pansexual, said,
I feel that they are necessary because we have to address individual problems for groups. When we erase labels, we tend to erase or ignore certain people, such as bi and pan people, being simply called gay.
Gwen, a bisexual female, agreed.
Labels are not necessary to accomplish equality. Acceptance is. Labels can help provide both communities for people with similarities while also providing people with simple descriptions of themselves or a group they may fit into.
Viviana said,
A label can be a thing of comfort, as you may pertain to a certain community, but it also has the potential to box somebody.
After asking this question, we came to the conclusion that people have mixed feelings about the necessity of labels. On one hand, it's helpful to align yourself with certain groups or names in order to be properly addressed, while on the other hand, it may be difficult to live without the label becoming a restricting force. We then asked a follow-up question, which was if the LG community was ever guilty of pushing labels on the queer community. If so, why?
I don't think labels were pushed on people. I think as being LGBT became more accepted, people began to discover more about themselves and come up with different labels as descriptors. The LG community may have wanted everyone to fit a category, so they forced different titles on people. Yes, I do think that labels sometimes separate people more than is necessary. And no, I do not think it was intentional.
What made the community adopt these labels? Did they reject these labels instead? Why?
I think labels are often adopted as a way for people to figure out what they are experiencing and find others who share those experiences. However, after the initial discovery phase, many choose to disregard labels because they do not want to be defined by them, while others enjoy finding words to identify themselves with. It's largely a personal choice.
After analyzing the follow-up questions, we understand that the queer community has a more healthy and positive relationship with labels. It can be used to experiment with your own identity and can lead to being comfortable within it. Most people we interviewed feel that labels aren't pushed upon the queer community and that it's an individual choice on whether to adopt them.
That brings us to the end of the peer discussion and also of our podcast. Thank you to our voice actors and our guest speakers for agreeing to be included in our episode. This has been Conflict and Compromise, the LGBT+ community. Thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in for our next edition, Trans Rights in America.